The year is 2025. A single spark ignites chaos across two continents. China, the world's rising superpower, makes an unthinkable move. It launches direct military action against Israel. Suddenly, the Middle East trembles. Oil markets panic. Diplomats scramble. And world leaders confront the terrifying possibility of a new global war. But what would truly happen if China went to war with Israel? Tonight, we break down the realities, the military, the diplomatic, the economic, and the human cost. This is not fiction. This is a geopolitical analysis of what could unfold in the world's most dangerous standoff. Before we continue, if you care about understanding world events beyond the headlines, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you in-depth geopolitical analysis, free from sensationalism but filled with insight. Now, let's begin. This video is for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote violence or conflict. The current geopolitical reality. To understand the consequences of a Chinese-Israeli war, we must first examine today's reality, the fragile web of alliances, dependencies, and rivalries that define the Middle East in 2025. China's presence in the region is not defined by soldiers or aircraft carriers, but by commerce, energy, and diplomacy. Nearly 40% of China's crude oil imports come from the Middle East, with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq among its top suppliers. In fact, despite international sanctions, Beijing has often purchased Iranian oil through discreet, discounted channels, keeping Tehran's economy alive while securing cheap energy for its industries. Israel, meanwhile, stands as Washington's closest ally in the region. Its military is one of the most advanced on Earth. Israel possesses cutting-edge air defense systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow 3, along with a fleet of F-35 stealth fighters, sophisticated drones, and world-class cyber warfare units. Beyond technology, Israel's unspoken advantage lies in its nuclear deterrent. While never officially acknowledged, most experts estimate the country holds between 80 to 100 nuclear warheads, a quiet but powerful insurance policy against existential threats. At first glance, China and Israel have no direct reason to collide. In fact, relations between the two have historically been pragmatic. Chinese companies have invested in Israeli technology sectors, while Israel has quietly courted Chinese trade. Yet beneath that cooperation lies an undercurrent of tension. Israel sees itself locked in a long-term struggle against Iran, a nation it views as an existential adversary. China, by contrast, has sought to deepen its partnership with Tehran. In 2021, Beijing signed a 25-year cooperation agreement with Iran, pledging $400 billion in investments in exchange for discounted oil. That pact cemented Iran's role as a cornerstone of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The divergence is clear. Israel's security depends on containing Iran, while China's energy future depends on supporting it. Now, add the United States into the equation. Washington views China as its primary strategic competitor. In recent years, U.S. officials have pressured Israel to limit Chinese investments in critical infrastructure, warning of espionage risks. As the U.S.-China rivalry deepens, Israel is being nudged closer to Washington's side and further from Beijing. So, where does this leave us in 2025? China stands as a critic and a mediator, condemning Israeli strikes on Iranian facilities while avoiding direct military involvement. Israel continues to strike Iranian targets across Syria and elsewhere, insisting it cannot allow Tehran to develop nuclear weapons. The United States provides cover, while Arab Gulf states tread carefully tied economically to China, but strategically to Washington. For now, the balance holds. China as a critic and supplier, Israel as a U.S.-backed military power, Iran as the constant flashpoint. But here lies the central question. What if China abandons restraint? What if Beijing decides to move beyond rhetoric to openly and militarily support Iran in a confrontation with Israel? That pivot, unlikely but catastrophic, would transform a regional standoff into a global crisis. It would pit Asia's rising power against the West's closest Middle Eastern ally. It would force the United States to confront not just Iran, but China itself. And it would send shockwaves across every oil market, every shipping route, every global institution. The world today is balanced on a knife's edge. One bold decision from Beijing could tilt it toward chaos. Why would China go to war with Israel? Wars do not erupt without cause. They are born of motives, political, economic, strategic. To imagine a future where China actively enters conflict with Israel, we must first examine the forces that could drive Beijing toward such a decision. At the surface, Beijing has no natural hostility toward Israel. But beneath the diplomatic surface, fault lines are growing deeper. 1. The Iran factor. Iran remains the beating heart of this scenario. For China, Tehran is not just a partner, it is a lifeline. Iran supplies discounted crude oil that fuels China's factories and secures its economic momentum. It sits at the crossroads of the Belt and Road Initiative, connecting Asia to Europe through highways, ports, and pipelines. When Israel conducts strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities or Revolutionary Guard bases, Beijing views these as not only attacks on Iran, but as destabilizing moves that jeopardize Chinese investments and energy security. Should Israel escalate its campaigns, perhaps striking deeper inside Iran or threatening Tehran's nuclear infrastructure, Beijing could reach a breaking point. Protecting Iran would no longer be about ideology. It would be about national survival through energy security. 2. The U.S. dimension. For decades, the Middle East has been Washington's chessboard. The U.S. a military presence in the Persian Gulf, its alliances with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and its role in safeguarding oil routes have cemented American dominance. But from Beijing's perspective, that dominance is a strategic trap. Every barrel of oil China imports passes through U.S. patrolled waters. Every shipping lane could, in theory, be blocked by an American naval blockade. If conflict between Israel and Iran intensifies and the U.S. sides openly with Israel, as it almost certainly would, Beijing may view the confrontation as inevitable escalation of the U.S.-China rivalry. In this calculation, supporting Iran against Israel becomes less about Tehran and more about undermining American control over the Middle East. 3. Arms, technology, and prestige. China has ambitions beyond oil. It seeks recognition as a global power capable of shaping conflicts and defending allies. Already, Beijing is the world's second-largest arms producer. Supplying Iran with advanced drones, hypersonic missiles, and radar systems would project strength, but joining Iran militarily would announce to the world, China is no longer a passive observer of Western wars. It is a direct player. Prestige matters in geopolitics. For a nation determined to rival the U.S., showing military resolve in a hot theater like the Middle East could serve Beijing's grand ambition to redefine the global order. 4. Domestic politics. War abroad often has roots at home. By 2025, China faces internal pressures, slowing economic growth, rising youth unemployment, and discontent over restricted freedoms. A bold foreign policy move could redirect nationalist sentiment outward, uniting the population under the banner of defending Iran, an anti-imperialist ally, against Israel and its American backers. Authoritarian systems, historically, have used external crises to consolidate control. A war in the Middle East could serve that purpose. 5. The red line scenario. Perhaps the most likely trigger is a red line event. Imagine this. Israel destroys an Iranian nuclear enrichment facility deep inside Natanz, killing dozens of scientists and sparking outrage across the Muslim world. Tehran invokes its defense pact with Beijing, demanding assistance. Now imagine, days later, a missile strike kills Chinese engineers working at a Belt and Road project in Iran. Public anger in China explodes. Nationalist voices demand retaliation. For Beijing, the choice shifts from strategic patience to strategic compulsion. And so we see the potential motives. Energy security. Strategic rivalry with the United States. Prestige on the global stage. Domestic unity. A red line event that demands action. On their own, none may be enough to push Beijing into direct confrontation with Israel. But combined, they form a perfect storm, a scenario where China's leadership decides the risks of inaction outweigh the dangers of war. And if that day arrives, the world will not witness a limited clash. It will see the spark of a regional inferno with global consequences. Military escalation. How the war would unfold if China truly steps into the battlefield alongside Iran. The Middle East becomes a powder keg where every spark could ignite catastrophe. The first moves would likely be indirect but devastating. Chinese weapons shipments, drones, air defense systems, cyber capabilities, would pour into Iran. Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, long backed by Tehran, could suddenly operate with next-generation Chinese technology, striking deeper into Israeli and Saudi territory than ever before. Israel, feeling cornered, would retaliate with precision airstrikes. But this time, the targets would not just be Iranian nuclear facilities. Any Chinese-supported installations, weapons depots, or naval assets could find themselves under Israeli fire. This escalates the danger for Beijing. The presence of Chinese personnel in Iran or at shipping facilities could make them direct targets. If Israeli missiles were to kill Chinese advisors or soldiers, the pressure for Beijing to strike back would become overwhelming. Meanwhile, the seas would grow tense. U.S. carrier strike groups, already stationed in the Persian Gulf, would move to secure the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most fragile oil artery. In response, China might deploy naval assets to protect oil tankers bound for its ports. One miscalculation, a drone buzzing a destroyer, a missile launched in error, could trigger an open clash. The stage would no longer be limited to Israel and Iran. The war would radiate outward, drawing in superpowers, militaries, and alliances. Every move would carry the risk of turning a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. Diplomatic breakdowns. The world reacts. Wars are not fought only with missiles and drones. They are also fought in boardrooms, embassies, and international forums. The moment China aligns militarily with Iran against Israel, diplomacy would fracture across the globe. Beijing has spent years cultivating relationships with Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, selling technology and building trade ties. Yet these nations remain deeply cautious of Iran's regional ambitions and hostile rhetoric against Israel. If China openly sides with Tehran, the Gulf's trust in Beijing would collapse. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, already edging closer to Washington and Tel Aviv through defense cooperation, would likely swing decisively into Israel's camp. This means more intelligence sharing, expanded U.S. military bases, and possibly even joint air defense networks across the Gulf. What China gains in Tehran, it loses in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. At the United Nations, the diplomatic storm would be relentless. Israel and its allies would present evidence of Chinese arms, military advisors, and satellite intelligence flowing to Iran. The West would demand sanctions, and although Russia might shield China at the Security Council, much of the world, including Europe, Japan, South Korea, and even India, would back punitive measures. China, long priding itself on neutrality in Middle Eastern disputes, would suddenly find itself branded as a combatant, not a peacemaker. This would also disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative, with projects across Africa and the Middle East thrown into uncertainty. Nations dependent on Chinese investment may hesitate to risk U.S. sanctions by aligning too closely with Beijing. Diplomacy, instead of easing the crisis, would become another battlefield where every alliance counts, and every vote at the UN signals which way the world is tilting. Economic fallout, the price of war. If missiles ignite the skies, markets tremble on the ground. In a conflict where China directly supports Iran against Israel, the world economy would feel the shockwaves before the first battle ends. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of global oil passes daily, would immediately become the most dangerous choke point on Earth. Iran, emboldened by Chinese backing, might threaten to block or mine the passage. Even a temporary disruption would send oil prices skyrocketing, potentially above $150 per barrel, triggering energy crises from Europe to Asia. China itself, a massive importer of Middle Eastern oil, would face the irony of crisis, attempting to secure Iranian crude at discount prices while global supply lines collapse. Shipping insurance rates would soar, tankers would reroute thousands of miles around Africa, and fuel costs could double in weeks. But the economic fallout wouldn't stop at oil. Global supply chains, already fragile after years of disruptions, would unravel. The Red Sea and Persian Gulf, critical arteries for international shipping, would become conflict zones. From semiconductors in Taiwan to consumer goods in Europe, trade would slow to a crawl. Factories in Asia could shut down due to energy shortages, while inflation grips Western markets. Sanctions would multiply. Washington and Brussels, already wary of Beijing's global influence, would impose secondary sanctions targeting Chinese companies trading with Iran. Major firms like Huawei, Costco, and state-owned banks could find themselves cut off from the dollar system. The effect? A chilling freeze on Chinese foreign investment and financial flows. What began as a regional clash between Israel and Iran would snowball into a worldwide economic emergency, punishing not only the combatants, but billions of innocent consumers across the globe. And history teaches us this truth. When economies stumble under the weight of war, governments grow desperate. Desperation, in geopolitics, often fuels escalation. Militarization of the region, proxy wars ignite. Wars are never fought on a single battlefield. When giants move, the earth shakes across continents. If China aligns itself militarily with Iran against Israel, the Middle East transforms overnight into a cauldron of proxy wars and unrestrained escalation. Iran's vast network of regional allies would awaken. Hezbollah in Lebanon, already armed with over 150,000 rockets, could unleash volleys deeper into Israeli territory. The Houthis in Yemen, with upgraded Chinese and Iranian drones, might target Israeli-linked shipping through the Red Sea, threatening the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a passage vital for global trade. In Syria and Iraq, militias trained by Iran's Revolutionary Guard could target U.S. and Israeli assets, stretching defenses thin. China's involvement would embolden these groups with advanced surveillance technology, cyber capabilities, and potentially long-range missile components. The battlefield would no longer be limited to Israel's borders. It would sprawl across the Levant, Gulf, and North Africa. Israel, facing attacks from multiple fronts, would escalate its military campaigns. Precision airstrikes on Beirut, Damascus, and Sana'a could follow, igniting full-scale clashes. Civilian casualties would surge, fueling outrage across the Arab world and placing U.S. aligned Gulf monarchies under severe domestic pressure. Meanwhile, Washington would expand its military footprint. U.S. carrier strike groups would anchor in the eastern Mediterranean and Arabian Sea. Patriot and THAAD missile systems could be deployed in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan to shield against Iranian Chinese missiles. At sea, the risk of direct clashes between U.S. and Chinese naval vessels would rise sharply, a scenario that global strategists fear could spiral out of control. Every drone strike, every intercepted missile, every naval encounter would bring the region closer to catastrophe. A proxy war, supercharged by the backing of global powers, risks becoming a direct confrontation, one where even a single miscalculation could ignite a wider blaze. This is no longer just about Israel and Iran. It is about who controls the Middle East and who pays the price for it. Diplomatic breakdown: the world splits apart. Wars are not only fought with missiles and armies. They are also waged in the chambers of diplomacy, where silence, abstention, and a single raised hand can alter the course of nations. If China were to openly support Iran in a war against Israel, the international order itself would fracture in real time. At the United Nations, debates would rage like never before. Israel and its allies would accuse China of violating international law, presenting satellite images of Chinese cargo ships delivering weapons or radar tracking data of Chinese-made drones over the skies of the Middle East. In response, Beijing would deny, deflect, and counter-accuse Israel of aggression against sovereign Iranian facilities. The Security Council would become paralyzed. Resolutions calling for sanctions or ceasefires would be vetoed, one by Washington, another by Beijing, perhaps even by Moscow. Gridlock would define global governance. In the Gulf states, the situation would be even more delicate. Nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, all critical suppliers of oil and hosts to American bases, would find themselves trapped between economic interdependence with China and strategic obligations to the United States. For Riyadh, the choice would be existential: support Israel too openly, and it risks alienating its own people and inflaming domestic anger. Lean toward Beijing, and it jeopardizes the U.S. security umbrella that has guaranteed its survival for decades. Europe, already fractured by energy crises and internal disputes, would split down familiar lines. Some nations, Germany, the UK, Poland, would side firmly with Washington and Jerusalem. Others, like France or Hungary, might push for neutrality, fearing a global economic collapse. Russia, meanwhile, would seize the moment. Publicly, Moscow might call for restraint, but privately it would see immense strategic gain in a world where U.S. forces are tied down in the Middle East. Kremlin advisors would whisper, "Let America bleed here," while Russia regains ground in Eastern Europe. The global South, from Latin America to Africa, would largely view China's move as a defiant stand against Western hegemony. In capitals from Caracas to Johannesburg, Beijing's narrative that it is defending sovereignty against Western double standards would resonate. Yet, even there, fear of economic blowback would keep many leaders cautious. Diplomatic alliances, carefully stitched together since the end of World War II, would begin to unravel. NATO would be strained. BRICS would be emboldened. The very fabric of the international system would be pulled apart not by ideology alone, but by the hard reality that one global power had chosen sides in one of the most dangerous conflicts of the 21st century. In such a fractured world, no voice is neutral, no silence is innocent, and no alliance is safe. Diplomacy itself becomes a battlefield, and the stakes are nothing less than the future of global order. Economic fallout, oil, sanctions, and global crisis. Wars in the Middle East are never confined to the battlefield. They spill into the arteries of the global economy, sending shockwaves through oil markets, trade routes, and financial systems. If China openly supported Iran in a war against Israel, the economic consequences would be immediate, severe, and global. At the center of this storm lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which nearly 20% of the world's oil supply flows daily. Iran has long threatened to close the strait if attacked. With Chinese backing, that threat would suddenly carry real teeth. Imagine Iranian naval forces, equipped with Chinese surveillance drones and missile systems, shadowing oil tankers. Even the possibility of a blockade would send crude oil prices soaring. Analysts estimate prices could spike above $150 per barrel within weeks, a shock greater than the 1973 oil crisis. China itself, though a partner to Iran, would not be immune. Beijing is the world's largest oil importer, and nearly half of its energy supply transits the Middle East. Disruption would hammer its factories, shipping lanes, and supply chains. Inflation in China could spread worldwide, raising the cost of everything from electronics to fertilizers. On the financial front, sanctions would intensify. The United States and European Union would push for sweeping restrictions on Chinese firms supplying weapons or dual-use technology to Iran. Secondary sanctions would target Chinese banks, shipping companies, and energy corporations. The consequences could rival the economic isolation once placed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, only this time applied to the world's second-largest economy. Global stock markets would spiral. Investors, fearing escalation, would flee to safe havens: gold, the US dollar, and government bonds. Emerging economies dependent on cheap oil would face devastating recessions. Nations from India to Brazil would see their growth projections collapse under the weight of soaring fuel costs and inflationary shocks. Meanwhile, the shipping industry would be thrown into chaos. With Chinese and US naval forces shadowing each other in the Indian Ocean, insurance premiums for commercial vessels would skyrocket. Some companies might refuse to operate in the Gulf altogether, rerouting ships around Africa, adding weeks and massive costs to global trade. The ripple effects would hit ordinary citizens worldwide. Gasoline prices at the pump could double. Heating costs would soar during winters in Europe. Food prices, tied to both fuel and fertilizer, would climb, sparking unrest in poorer nations. Wars are often measured in territory gained or lives lost. But in a world this interconnected, the battlefield is also your grocery store, your gas station, your paycheck. If China joins Iran against Israel, the economic war would touch every single person on the planet. Militarization of the region, proxy wars, naval standoffs, and escalation risks, conflict rarely stays clean. Once major powers take sides, the battlefield expands beyond borders into deserts, oceans, and skies. If China openly supports Iran against Israel, the Middle East would rapidly transform into one of the most militarized regions in modern history. First, proxy wars would ignite with new ferocity. Iran's longtime allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq, could suddenly receive not just Iranian weapons, but Chinese surveillance systems, drones, and precision-guided munitions. Hezbollah alone is believed to possess over 150,000 rockets and missiles, but with Chinese support, those weapons could become more accurate, longer ranged, and harder to intercept. Israel, already stretched by conflicts in Gaza and the West Bank, would face the nightmare of a multi-front war. Its Iron Dome, David's Sling, and arrow systems would be pushed to the breaking point as salvos of rockets, drones, and ballistic missiles pour in from multiple directions. At sea, the tension would escalate dramatically. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, already patrols the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. If China dispatched its own warships, perhaps a carrier strike group or guided missile destroyers, the risk of accidental clashes would skyrocket. A Chinese frigate shadowing a U.S. carrier, a drone buzzing too close to an American destroyer. One wrong move, and the Gulf could erupt into direct confrontation between superpowers. Meanwhile, the Red Sea and Indian Ocean would become choke points of contest. Iran-backed Houthi forces have already demonstrated their ability to strike commercial shipping with drones and missiles. With Chinese intelligence or logistical support, these attacks could multiply, threatening one of the busiest maritime trade routes in the world. Airspace would be equally dangerous. Israeli F-35 stealth fighters, U.S. bombers, Iranian drones, and potentially Chinese surveillance aircraft would crowd skies where even a single miscalculation, a missile lock, a mistaken radar signal, could ignite a chain reaction. The militarization wouldn't just be regional. NATO could reinforce positions in the Mediterranean. Russia, seeking leverage, might exploit the chaos to expand its own influence in Syria or the Caucasus. India, caught between reliance on both U.S. and Chinese trade, would face a precarious balancing act as naval activity expanded near its shores. Most dangerous of all, the risk of escalation into weapons of mass destruction. Israel has long maintained a policy of ambiguity regarding its nuclear arsenal, but analysts estimate it possesses 80-90 nuclear warheads. If Israel felt existentially threatened by a China-backed Iran, the possibility of nuclear signaling, or even limited use, could not be ruled out. History reminds us that great wars often start not from grand plans, but from accidents. A ship collision, a missile fired too close, a misread radar. With so many militaries in such close quarters, the Middle East could become the world's most dangerous tinderbox. If China were to go to war with Israel, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just for the Middle East, but for the entire world. Oil markets would crash. Superpowers would collide. Proxy wars would explode. And the fragile balance of global peace could collapse overnight. This is why understanding geopolitics is so important. The choices nations make in moments of crisis do not stay confined to one region. They ripple across the planet. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like this video, comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into global conflicts and their consequences. Together, let's stay informed in a world where knowledge is power.